The son of the High Valley was a merciless anvil, and upon it, Anyar hammered out the remaining days of summer. 70 years had carved their own map upon her face, a terrain of hardship and survival that the townsfolk in the hollow below could not read. They saw only a peculiar old woman engaged in a frantic, strange ritual. From the first blush of dawn until the last embers of twilight faded behind the granite peaks, she worked. Her small cabin was flanked by a city of wooden racks, raw timber lashed together with cured sinew, each one groaning under the weight of her labor. She moved with a slow, deliberate economy that belied her age, a rhythm born of memory and necessity. The work began with the hunt. Not her own, for her tracking days were past, but Jed, the trapper, would leave a share of his venison or elk at her doorstep in exchange for her remedies for his joint pain. She would lay the great haunches on a scrubbed plank table, her knife, worn thin as a willow leaf, separating muscle from bone with an anatomist's precision. The meat was sliced into thin, uniform strips, a task that required a steady hand and an unwavering eye. Each ruby ribbon was then laid in a shallow wooden trough and buried in a coarse mixture of salt and crushed juniper berries, the sharp, clean scent a constant perfume around her home. For 3 days, the meat would cure, drawing out the moisture, turning the flesh a deep, promising burgundy. Then came the hanging. One by one, she threaded the strips onto long skewers and draped them over the racks, arranging them so the mountain breeze, thin and dry, could worry every surface. The sun was her accomplice, its relentless heat baking the meat until it was hard as wood and dark as mahogany. It was not just meat. All summer, she had been a tireless forager. Her leather apron was perpetually stained with the juice of wild berries, which she mashed and spread onto sheets of scraped hide to dry into brittle, sweet wafers. She gathered wild onions and hardy roots from the stony soil, slicing them into coin-thin discs that shriveled and crisped on the racks, concentrating their pungent flavor. Mushrooms, great fans of them from the shaded pine forests, were strung on twine and hung like strange, earthy garlands from the eaves of her porch. The townsfolk, passing on the low road, would stop and stare. Their whispers were carried on the same breeze that cured her provisions. They saw not prudence, but madness. A hoarding, a senseless fixation. Young Finn, a boy with eyes that saw more than they spoke, would often sit on a boulder up the hill, watching her. He never mocked. He watched the way her hands knew just how much salt to use, the way she could tell a mushroom was safe by its scent, the way she tested the dryness of a strip of meat by the sound it made when she tapped it with a fingernail. He saw a language in her movements, a story the others were too loud to hear. As autumn began to bleed gold and rust into the valley's edges, Anyar's work intensified. She brought the finished provisions inside, her small cabin slowly filling with the rich, savory scent of a winter that had not yet arrived. The jerky was stacked like firewood, the dried vegetables sealed in clay pots capped with beeswax, the fruit leather rolled and tied with twine. Her shelves, bare in the spring, were now a fortress of sustenance, a silent testament to a summer spent in defiance of an unseen enemy. The talk in the town of Prosperity Hollow was a low, persistent hum, like flies buzzing over spilled molasses in Sterling's mercantile. It was the only store, the nexus of all commerce and gossip, and Mr. Sterling himself presided over it with a quiet, proprietary air. He was a man built of soft edges and hard calculations, his waistcoat always buttoned, his gaze always assessing the value of things and people. Anyar was a recurring topic, a source of communal amusement and pity. "It's the loneliness, I expect," Mrs. Gable said one afternoon, her voice carrying across the store's dusty floorboards. She was a woman whose social standing was built on the perceived failings of others. Up there on that ridge, all by her lonesome. The mind begins to wander. All that food, drying in the sun. It'll be rot or rock by first snow. A terrible waste. Reverend Michael, picking out a small sack of flour, offered a more pious interpretation. He was a good man, but his faith was a comfortable blanket that had never been tested by true cold. "We must pray for her," he intoned, his voice gentle but firm. "She puts her faith in dried meat instead of the Lord's providence. We are told to take no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself." Mr. Sterling, polishing the worn countertop with a rag, said nothing. He simply listened. Anyar's self-sufficiency was a small but irritating anomaly in his perfectly balanced ledger. Every resident of the valley depended on him. They bought his seed in the spring, sold him their meager harvests in the fall, and ran a line of credit with him through the winter. Their dependence was his power. Anya, with her endless racks of food, did not depend on him. She did not need his credit. She was a closed loop, an unaccounted-for variable, and he found it deeply unsettling. He watched Jed haul a quartered elk up the path to her cabin and made a quiet note in his mind. He saw Finn carrying buckets of water for her from the creek and felt a flicker of annoyance. Her eccentricity was becoming a form of independence, and that he could not abide. The mockery of the town served his purpose, isolating her, marking her as other. He even encouraged it with a sad shake of his head or a quiet comment about the poor old dear. They saw a broken mind, he saw an unbroken will, and it was a thing he instinctively knew must be either owned or destroyed. The scent of pine was sharp and clean in the cooling air, a scent of memory. Anya knelt, her old hands digging around the base of a gnarled tree, searching for the last of the season's edible roots. The rough bark scraped her knuckles, and the sensation, so familiar, was a key turning a lock in the deep, quiet house of her past. Suddenly, she was not on the ridge above Prosperity Hollow. She was a young woman, decades younger, in a different valley, a harder country to the north. The snows had come early that year, a hungry wolf of a winter that devoured the autumn whole. They had been unprepared. Her husband, strong and proud, had laughed at her worries, his voice booming in their small cabin. "The stores are full enough, my love. God is good, but the snow had a different God, one of silence and ice. It fell for a month without ceasing. The pass vanished. The world became a small, white room. The food ran low, then ran out. The laughter died first. Then the warmth." She remembered the gnawing, hollow ache in her belly, a creature eating her from the inside out. She remembered boiling leather from boots to make a thin, foul broth. She remembered the look in her husband's eyes as his strength failed, a look of shocked disbelief that the world could be so cruel, so final. But the sharpest memory, the one that lived behind her eyes like a shard of obsidian, was of her daughter. A small girl with hair the color of summer wheat. She remembered holding the child's tiny, cold body, a feather-light weight that felt heavier than the whole world. The silence in the cabin after the crying stopped was a physical thing, a crushing pressure that had reshaped her soul. She had survived. She had eaten what was left, her own hunger a monstrous thing that shamed her, and when the spring thaw finally came, she had walked out of that valley alone. She had walked until she found this place, this ridge, and she had vowed that silence, that particular, hungry silence, would never find her again. This was the prayer she lived by, not the reverend's words, but the ritual of her hands, the litany of salt and sun and smoke. The townsfolk saw madness in her work, but she knew it to be the most profound act of sanity. It was a war against memory, a fortress built not of stone, but of sustenance. Mr. Sterling's visit was not unexpected. He moved up the path to her cabin with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who believes his own time is more valuable than anyone else's. He did not look at the racks of drying food, though their presence dominated the clearing. He pretended they were invisible, a minor eccentricity to be politely ignored. Anya was splitting kindling, the axe falling with a steady, metronomic rhythm. She did not stop when he approached, but continued her work, acknowledging his presence only with a slight, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. "Good afternoon, Anya," he began, his voice smooth and oiled as the lock on his mercantile's front door. "A fine day. The last of them, I think." There's a chill in that breeze. She split another log with a clean crack before finally setting the axe aside. She wiped her hands on her apron, her gaze steady and unreadable. Mr. Sterling, his smile was meant to be disarming, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've come on a matter of business. And concern. A woman of your years, living up here alone. It's a heavy burden. This land, this cabin. It requires a strong back. A man's back, if we're being honest." He paused, letting the insult settle. She did not react. "I am prepared," he continued, "to make you a generous offer. For the land. Enough to see you settled comfortably in town, perhaps in the room above the mercantile. Warm, dry. No need for all this effort. He finally gestured vaguely at the racks, his mask of politeness slipping to reveal a flicker of distaste. Anya looked from his clean, soft hands to her own, which were calloused and stained with earth and salt. She thought of the small, silent grave in the northern valley. She thought of the freedom of this ridge, of the honest ache in her muscles at the end of the day. She looked at this man who traded independence, who saw her life's work as a mere burden to be bought and sold. Her answer was not in words. It was in the slow, deliberate way she picked up her axe again, turning her back to him. She positioned another log on the block, her focus absolute. The message was clear. "Think on it," Sterling said, his voice hardening slightly. "Winter is a cruel season for those who are alone and unprepared." The axe fell, cleaving the wood in two. It was the only reply he would receive. The signs were there for those who knew how to read them. The high peaks, which usually held their snow caps until late spring, were already shrouded in a deep, permanent white that crept further down their slopes each morning. The elk and deer, normally content in the high meadows until the first heavy snowfall, were moving down into the valley in great, nervous herds, their coats thick and shaggy. Jed the trapper saw it. He stood outside Anya's cabin, having just delivered a brace of rabbits. He squinted at the sky, a vast, pale canvas that looked too bright, too empty. "Sky's got a hungry look," he grunted, more to himself than to her. "The squirrels have buried every nut and cone for a mile, and the birds. They've been gone a week." Too quiet. Anya nodded, her eyes on the same blank sky. She felt it in her bones, an old ache that spoke of a change in pressure, a shift in the world's weight. Doc Hemlock, a man of science who nonetheless respected the valley's ancient wisdom, also felt the unease. He saw it in the frantic energy of the animals and the strange, metallic taste of the air. He mentioned his concerns to Reverend Michael, who smiled benevolently. "Nature has its rhythms, Doctor. We must have faith." But the doc saw Anya's relentless work and recognized a different kind of faith, a faith in experience, in the hard lessons of the past. He began quietly adding to his own stores of medicinal herbs and bandages, a concession to an instinct he could not scientifically explain. The work on the ridge became urgent. The last of the jerky was brought in, the final bundles of dried herbs tied and hung from the cabin's rafters. Finn was there every day now, his small, quick hands a welcome help. He stacked the jerky, sealed the clay pots with Anya, and hauled firewood until great stacks stood like sentinels around the cabin. No words of instruction were needed. He watched, he learned, he did. A silent apprenticeship had formed between the old woman and the young boy, a bond forged in shared purpose. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of furious orange and purple, a color of warning, Anya gave him a small, tightly wrapped bundle of dried venison and berry leather. He tried to refuse, but she simply pressed it into his hands and gently pushed him toward the path home. It was not a payment. It was a precaution. The snow began not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden, silent declaration of war. One moment, the world was grey and still; the next, it was a churning vortex of white. The flakes were not delicate crystals, but thick, heavy pellets that fell with a sinister purpose, erasing the world's edges and corners. The path to the outside world, the treacherous mountain pass that was the valley's only artery, was the first casualty. It vanished within hours, buried under an impassable tide of white. At first, the people of Prosperity Hollow treated it as an inconvenience, even a novelty. It was an early storm, they told each other, a fierce one, but it would blow itself out in a day or two. Sterling's supply train was due, and it had never failed to get through. They gathered in the mercantile, the pot-bellied stove glowing red, and spoke with a forced cheerfulness. But the storm did not blow itself out. It settled in, a vast, suffocating presence that pressed down on the valley. Days turned into a week. The wind rose to a constant, shrieking moan that scoured the landscape and piled the snow into monstrous drifts that swallowed fences and buried the lower windows of houses. The world shrank to the confines of snow-walled rooms. The sound of everything was muffled, absorbed by the immense, sound-deadening blanket of the storm. Up on her ridge, Anya's cabin was a small, defiant island in the white sea. The wind howled around her eaves, but inside, the fire was warm, and the air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and preserved food. She was sealed in, but she was not trapped. She was provisioned. She moved about her small home with the same calm, methodical rhythm she had maintained all summer. She checked her stores, banked her fire, and listened to the voice of the storm, a voice she knew all too well. It was the sound of the world holding its breath. Down in the valley, the forced cheerfulness was beginning to curdle into a low-grade, unspoken fear. Sterling's supply train was not coming. Nothing was coming. They were alone. 2 weeks bled into 3, and the white silence deepened. The storm did not relent, it merely changed its rhythm, pausing for breathless, freezing days of blinding sun on snow, then returning with renewed fury at night. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that seeped through the chinks in every wall and crept across the floors. Firewood, carelessly gathered, ran low. The initial denial in the valley gave way to a raw, gnawing anxiety. Mr. Sterling's mercantile, once a place of community, became a fortress of dwindling hope. He began rationing, his practiced smile replaced by a tight, grim line. A small scoop of flour, a handful of beans, the price for each was a portion of a family's dignity. His ledger was now a tool of absolute power. Those who had been his friends, who had laughed at his jokes and endorsed his opinions, found their ration slightly more generous. Those who had been neutral, or quietly resentful, received the bare minimum. The community, once bound by shared gossip and easy judgment, began to fracture. Whispers were no longer about the eccentric old woman on the hill, they were about whose chimney had no smoke, whose children looked too thin. Mrs. Gable, who had once so loudly pitied Agniar's wastefulness, now stood in the ration line with a pinched, desperate look on her face. Reverend Michael led prayers for deliverance in the freezing church, but his words, which had once seemed so full of comfort, now rang hollow against the backdrop of empty stomachs and the ceaseless howl of the wind. Faith was a difficult thing to feel when your children were crying from hunger. The carefully constructed social order of Prosperity Hollow was unraveling, thread by thread, revealing the stark, simple truth beneath: they were all unprepared. Their mockery of Agniar had been a form of arrogance, a belief in their own modernity, in the infallibility of their supply lines and the certainty of their seasons. They had outsourced their survival to one man, and now, with the world sealed off, they were discovering the true cost of their dependence. Fear became the new currency, and it was a currency everyone had in abundance. Jed the Trapper was a proud man, but his pride was no match for the hollow look in his wife's eyes or the quiet, listless way his children sat by the fire. He had been a good provider, his traps and rifle always bringing home meat. But in this endless white wilderness, the game had vanished, buried or fled to impenetrable depths of the forest. His own stores, meant for a normal winter, were gone. He had swallowed his pride once and gone to Sterling, only to be offered a pittance of flour in exchange for the last of his valuable furs, a trade so lopsided it was little more than theft. For 2 days, he wrestled with himself. He remembered his own dismissive snorts at the sight of Agniar's racks. He remembered thinking her a crazy old woman, lost in the past. The memory burned in his throat like bile. But the image of his daughter, her face pale and thin, was a more potent fire. On the 3rd day, he rose before dawn. The journey to Agniar's Ridge was a brutal, chest-deep struggle through the snow. The wind cut at his face, and the cold was a physical pain in his lungs. When he finally reached her clearing, he was exhausted, a man stripped bare of everything but need. He stood before her door for a long moment, his hand raised to knock, his heart pounding with a mixture of shame and desperation. The cabin looked impossibly sturdy, a bastion of warmth and life in the dead world. Smoke curled bravely from its stone chimney. He finally knocked. The sound was loud in the immense silence. The door opened. Agniar stood there, her silhouette framed by the warm light from within. She looked at him, her eyes taking in his frost-rimmed beard, his labored breathing, the deep despair etched onto his face. She did not speak. He could not. Words were useless things now. His shame was a stone in his mouth. He could only stand there, a beggar at the gates of the fortress he had ridiculed. Agniar looked at him for a heartbeat longer, then turned and disappeared into the cabin's interior. He thought perhaps she had dismissed him, sent him away to starve with his pride. But she returned a moment later, carrying a heavy bundle wrapped in cloth. She pushed it into his hands. It was heavy with the dense weight of dried meat, vegetables, and fruit leather. He looked down at the bundle, then back up at her face. He tried to form the word thanks, but it wouldn't come. He simply nodded, his eyes stinging with something other than the cold. She gave a single, slow nod in return, and then quietly closed the door. Word of Jed's journey and its outcome spread through the hollow not like wildfire, but like smoke seeping under doorways, a slow, quiet, pervasive thing. It was a rumor of hope, but it was also a confirmation of their collective shame. Jed did not boast, he simply fed his family. But the evidence was there in the savory smell of cooking stew that curled from his chimney, a scent of life that had been absent from the valley for weeks. For a day, pride held the others back. Then, a second man, a farmer named Ben whose own silo was empty, made the arduous trek up the ridge. He, too, returned with a bundle and a humbled look in his eyes. That broke the dam. The next morning, a thin, dark line of figures could be seen struggling through the snow, a slow pilgrimage of the desperate and the ashamed. They came one by one, or in small family groups, their faces etched with the harsh realities of hunger. They did not come with the easy confidence they had shown at Sterling's counter. They came as supplicants. Mrs. Gable was among them, her face wrapped in a shawl, her eyes fixed on the snow at her feet, unable to meet the gaze of the woman she had so publicly mocked. Reverend Michael came, his Bible clutched in his hand, and when Anya gave him his portion, he offered a halting prayer of thanks, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond piety. It was humility, raw and painful. Anya met them all with the same stoic grace. She had Finn by her side now. The boy had made his own way to her cabin days before, his own family's small pantry bare. He worked with a quiet intensity, his young face serious as he helped Anya portion out the food. He was the keeper of the unspoken ledger, ensuring that each family received what they needed, that the stores were distributed with a fairness that Sterling's mercantile had never known. Anya did not ask for apologies or thanks. She did not lord her foresight over them. Her vindication was not in their shame, but in the simple, profound act of giving. She was not a savior, she was a survivor, and she was sharing the tools of that survival. Down in the town, Mr. Sterling watched from his window as the trail to Anya's cabin became a beaten path. His power, built on the carefully managed scarcity he controlled, had been broken by an old woman's memory and a force of nature he could not bargain with. His store was still full, but his customers were gone. He was a king with no subjects, isolated in a fortress of his own making. The thaw came as slowly and deliberately as the storm had first arrived. It began not with warmth, but with a change in the light, a subtle softening of the world's brutal white edges. Then came the sound, a tentative dripping from the eaves that grew into a steady, rhythmic percussion, the heartbeat of a world reawakening. The great, oppressive silence was broken. The sun, when it finally broke through the clouds, seemed impossibly bright, and the valley, which had been a monochrome prison, began to reveal its contours again under the shrinking blanket of snow. The pass would not be clear for weeks, but the siege was over. The people of Prosperity Hollow emerged from their homes, blinking in the renewed light, thinner, quieter, and irrevocably changed. The arrogance had been scoured out of them by cold and hunger. The crisis had been a harsh fire, burning away their petty judgments and leaving behind a raw, humbled core of community. There was no celebration, no triumphant feast. There was only work to be done. The first communal act was not a church service, but a gathering on the ridge outside Anya's cabin. Jed was there, and Ben the farmer, and a half-dozen other men, their tools in hand. They did not ask permission. They simply began to work, clearing the ground, felling young pines, and, under Jed's quiet direction, beginning construction on a series of new drying racks, twice as long and twice as sturdy as Anya's old ones. The women came too, bringing what little food they could spare to share, and worked to clear the paths and gather the newly exposed firewood. They were preparing. Not just for the next winter, but for a new way of living. Finn stayed by Anya's side, no longer just an observer, but a true apprentice. He watched the men notch the logs, learning the geometry of strength and stability. Anya watched them all, her face as serene and weathered as the mountains themselves. The long winter had taken its toll, but there was a light in her eyes that had not been there before, a softening of the harsh lines of memory. As the men raised the first new rack, a skeleton of future preparedness against the bright blue sky, she placed a hand on Finn's shoulder. He looked up at her, his young face open and ready. "We prepare," she said, her voice quiet but clear as the meltwater running in the creek. Not from fear, but from respect. For the sky. For the hunger. For each other. It was the longest speech he had ever heard her make. It was enough. The community was no longer a chorus of judgment, but a small, determined band of survivors, their future held not in a merchant's ledger, but in their own calloused, capable hands.